The 1980s were a curious time in American motorsports. On the surface, everything seemed settled. The rules were written, the winners were predictable, and the technology was locked in place. But beneath that veneer of stability, a quiet revolution was brewing. Not from the establishment, not from the manufacturers that had dominated the sport for decades. It came from a single man with an obsession and a six-cylinder dream that nobody wanted to believe was possible. His name was Buddy Ingersoll, and what he was about to accomplish would shake pro stock racing to its foundations and create a controversy that would define the entire decade. To understand the significance of what Buddy Ingersoll was about to unleash, you first have to understand the world that pro stock racing occupied in the middle of the 1980s. The National Hot Rod Association had been running pro stock since 1970, and by 1982, they had settled on what they believed was the perfect formula: a 500 cubic inch maximum displacement, a weight floor of 2,350 pounds, and an almost exclusive reliance on naturally aspirated V8 engines. For the most part, it worked beautifully. The rules were stable, the competition was fierce, and there was a sense that the class had reached its limit of technological progression. But there was a problem hiding beneath the surface. While the NHRA had settled comfortably into their 500 cubic inch world, the International Hot Rod Association had taken a radically different approach. In the early 1980s, the IHRA had decided to go unlimited on displacement while keeping weight at 2,350 pounds. This decision created what became known as mountain motor pro stock. These cars were absolutely insane, engines pushing well beyond 700 cubic inches, producing horsepower figures that seemed almost fictional. 7-second elapsed times were becoming common in the IHRA. The NHRA simply couldn't match it on the national stage, and the drag racing public was beginning to notice. Into this environment stepped a man who looked at all of this conventional wisdom and asked a simple question: what if there was another way? What if instead of building bigger and bigger naturally aspirated V8 engines, you could use a smaller displacement engine with forced induction? The thought had occurred to others, but nobody had pursued it with the singular focus and engineering brilliance that Buddy Ingersoll would bring to bear. He would spend the next several years proving that the automobile industry, the sanctioning bodies, and the entire drag racing establishment had been thinking about power all wrong. Before Buddy Ingersoll became a household name in drag racing circles, he was already a proven winner. In the modified Eliminator class, he had earned his stripes as a skilled driver and an innovative engineer. His 1977 NHRA Modified Eliminator World Championship proved that he had the talent to compete at the highest levels. But Ingersoll was never the type to rest on his laurels. He was someone who looked at the status quo and immediately began thinking about how to disrupt it. If he could see that something was being done inefficiently or conventionally, he would obsess over finding a better way. In the late 1970s, Ingersoll had begun experimenting with turbocharging in drag racing. His first major project was a turbocharged Ford Pinto running in the competition eliminator ranks. The Pinto was nothing special by today's standards, but in the late 1970s and early 1980s, watching a six-cylinder engine produce competitive horsepower against traditionally powerful V8s turned heads. Ohio George Montgomery had shown some promise with a turbocharged Pinto as well, but Ingersoll believed he could push the concept even further. When the opportunity presented itself, Ingersoll saw his opening. He would take a car that had already proven itself at the highest levels of pro stock racing and transform it into something nobody had ever seen before. But first, he would need an engine unlike anything that had come before it. He would need to partner with one of the most iconic American automotive brands and convince them that what he was proposing made sense. That brand was Buick. In the mid-1980s, Buick was on a mission. The company had been losing its image as a performance brand. V6 engines were becoming more sophisticated, more powerful, and more efficient. Buick's marketing department saw an opportunity to prove that a six-cylinder engine could be powerful enough to stand alongside traditional V8s in racing. When Buddy Ingersoll came calling with his concept, Buick was willing to listen. The engine that would power the legendary turbo Buick was a marvel of mechanical engineering. Starting with a 3.8-liter displacement, which translated to approximately 268 cubic inches, Buick's Special Projects Department created something truly special. This wasn't a hastily modified street engine. This was purpose-built racing machinery designed from the ground up to handle extreme boost and enormous power outputs. A team of approximately a dozen engineers from Buick's Special Projects Department handled the initial build. But the real genius came from the partnership with Morrison Racing Engines and Allen's engine-building expertise. Allen and Ingersoll spent countless hours on the dynamometer, obsessing over every detail. Their particular focus was on something that most engine builders didn't think twice about: the fuel curve. Unlike conventional race engines that lean out at low RPM and enrich as RPM climbs, Ingersoll and Allen worked to create a fuel curve that was nearly the opposite. They needed the engine to run lean at low RPMs and rich at high RPMs. This seemingly backwards approach was crucial to making the turbocharged engine work effectively. To accomplish this without the benefit of modern electronic fuel injection, they created what they referred to as a mechanical brain within the fuel system. It was essentially a mechanical analog computer using a series of valves and reliefs that adjusted fuel volume based on RPM and manifold pressure. It was a solution that should never have worked, but it did. The dual turbocharged Buick V6 in its final form was reportedly producing somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 horsepower. Most of the engines used were very similar, if not identical, to those employed in the Indy car program supported by Buick. The crucial difference was that drag racing had no boost limitations. The possibilities seemed endless. When Buddy Ingersoll first took the turbocharged Buick Regal to the drag strip in 1985, he mounted a large single turbocharger in front of the engine and blew it through a homemade intercooler setup. By all available sources, this is the configuration he ran throughout the entire 1985 season. While it would eventually give way to a faster twin-turbo program, the single turbo proved highly effective. The real breakthrough came at the 1985 North Star Nationals held in Brainerd, Minnesota. This was the event that truly put the turbo car on the map. Ingersoll qualified the car in the number 9 position, posting runs in the high 100s and 70s for elapsed times. But as he had done so many times before when he arrived at major national events, Buddy didn't show his best stuff until race day. In the first round, he unloaded a monster run of 7.72 at 183.67 miles per hour. His qualifying elapsed time would have actually put him in the pro stock field. By the time Ingersoll finished with his competitors that weekend, he had ripped off 3 consecutive 7.3-second passes. He was within 1/10 of a second of the then-existing pro stock national record. Most importantly, his qualifying time of 7.97 was running on the same 850 index as other cars with different shapes and sizes in the Double B altered category. The quick result was that the Buick was placed in its own class, Double B altered turbo. The big difference was that the index changed from 850 to 8 seconds flat. In Competition Eliminator with its handicap-style start, a lower index means you have to be faster to actually win rounds. Moving from an 850 index to an 8 flat index meant that to win rounds, the car had to be worked much harder than before. It effectively meant that to defeat the same competition, the car would have to be about half a second faster than it had been. Despite these obstacles, Ingersoll continued undeterred. He qualified number 1 at the North Star Nationals, running 770s at over 180 miles per hour, and won the race in Competition Eliminator. It was the last national event win for the Buick in Competition Eliminator. But that one race shot him into superstardom in the drag racing world. Suddenly, the cries and screams from drag racing fans and enthusiasts alike to get this car into pro stock grew much louder. By the time Buddy Ingersoll arrived at the 1986 racing season, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to remain in Competition Eliminator. He was going to take this car to the highest level of drag racing. The NHRA had said no to his pro stock entry proposal. They had concerns about the engine, concerns about displacement, concerns about weight factoring, and quite frankly, concerns about what this car would do to the established order. So Ingersoll turned to the IHRA and their Mountain Motor Pro Stock class. This was his shot, and he was going to make the most of it. For the 1986 IHRA season, Ingersoll switched from the large single turbo mounted in front of the engine to smaller twin turbos placed in a more favorable position near the front tires. This significantly improved weight distribution and aided the car's launch characteristics. He also began the season with a unique intercooler setup that injected liquid nitrogen and glycol into a sandwich configuration. Though through the first 3 IHRA national events of the season, the car struggled, but the locals and the racers were getting nervous. Then came Bristol, Tennessee, for the 1986 IHRA Fall Nationals. And everything changed. Ingersoll's IHRA Pro Stock combination was, according to his own account, the mirror image of his NHRA competition eliminator combo with 260 inches and twin turbos. The car was fast. The intercooling was better. He had a full season of experience under his belt, and now he was facing the best naturally aspirated mountain motors in the world. That's when the political firestorm erupted. Ingersoll muscled his way through the early rounds of competition. He defeated Ricky Smith, the current world pro champion for IHRA, with a 7.33 at 192.30 miles per hour in one of the most stunning upsets the drag racing world had ever witnessed. He reached the final round. Standing across the starting line was Bob Glidden, the most dominant pro stock driver of the era, the man who had won 5 straight NHRA Pro Stock championships. Glidden was in an IHRA Pro Stock Thunderbird running on naturally aspirated power. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. A massive V8 against a tiny V6, thousands of hours of development by multiple manufacturers against one man's obsession. Glidden posted a 7.282 at 193.96. Ingersoll's turbocharged V6 slowed to a 7.371 at 189.07. Glidden won the race. But the damage had been done. The establishment was terrified. What happened next is the subject of considerable speculation. Some people claim that Ingersoll lifted off the throttle to preserve his car's legality. For decades, rumors swirled that he had intentionally backed off to avoid further angering the sanctioning bodies and the racing community. When asked about it years later, Ingersoll was categorical in his denial. "I've raced all of my life trying to beat people as bad as I could beat them," he said. "I would have run him wide open all the way, even if we would have raced to the ocean. I'm not like that. I get enjoyment out of beating people." Whether he was going as hard as he could or not, the reaction was swift. The sponsors freaked out. Ford and Chevrolet and Oldsmobile and Pontiac had all invested enormous amounts of money in their big block cylinder head programs for Pro Stock. They were terrified that this little 6-cylinder was going to make all of those investments look foolish. Ted Jones, the head of the IHRA, found himself in an impossible political position. He made the only decision he could make under the circumstances. He called Buddy Ingersoll and told him the car was no longer allowed in IHRA Mountain Motor Pro Stock. The brief IHRA career was over. With his IHRA career behind him, Ingersoll returned the machine back to NHRA's competition eliminator. Buick claimed they would submit the proper paperwork to have the car considered for NHRA Pro Stock. For years, Ingersoll and his supporters held out hope that the formal discussion would happen. But there were varying reports of missed meetings and vague promises that never materialized. The complications of allowing this car into Pro Stock were many. Beyond the fact that there would have to be immediate factoring and weight changes made for the turbocharged cars versus the naturally aspirated cars, there was another and potentially larger element involved. Pontiac, Chevrolet, Ford, and Oldsmobile had all invested in their own big block cylinder head programs for NHRA Pro Stock in that era. One could do some quick math and determine that they were not enthusiastic about seeing those expensive efforts throttled by Buick, who had not invested resources in the class, but had a car that would show up and clean house. Yet what few people remember is that Buddy Ingersoll had a second turbocharged Buick that debuted for the 1987 season. This was a far more aerodynamic and frankly oddball Buick Somerset Regal. In many ways, it was a more conventional pro-stock-style race car. The car began with a Don Hardy chassis that was later modified by Illinois chassis builder Larry Lemmy. With the identical engine combination from the Regal and the improved chassis and aerodynamics, the car immediately ran in the 7.20 seconds, posting a 7.29 at 194 miles per hour. But his efforts to compete in NHRA Pro Stock met with the same political resistance. Then came the 1989 season and the 1989 Chief Nationals in Dallas. Partnered with Floridian Jeff Velde, the Regal made history when it became the first Buick to qualify for an NHRA Pro Stock show. The feat was repeated numerous times in 1990. For the first time in his quest, Ingersoll had proof that this car belonged in Pro Stock. The car continued to chase 200 miles per hour in NHRA competition eliminator through the remainder of the season. Eventually, the car would break 200 miles per hour and mark the end of the Turbo Buick era. A team that had been chasing that record throughout 1985 and 1986 and 1987 and had finally achieved it more than half a decade later, standing as a triumph of engineering and persistence against a tide of corporate politics. The story of Buddy Ingersoll and his turbocharged Buick is not ultimately about a single race car. It's about what happens when innovation threatens the established order. When Ingersoll first proposed bringing this car to pro stock racing, nobody from the NHRA or the manufacturers sat down and had an honest conversation about the merits of the idea. What should have been a technical discussion about displacement and weight factoring became a political battle about protecting established investments. To this day, many people erroneously believe that the NHRA banned the Buick from pro stock. But the reality is more subtle and more damning. The car never ran in NHRA Pro Stock. It was never allowed to run in the category. Therefore, it was never banned for being in the category. The Buick never competed in the one thing Ingersoll truly wanted, NHRA Pro Stock on a professional level. He qualified for shows, he ran competitive times, but he never got the ultimate validation that would have come from winning an NHRA Pro Stock national event with the twin-turbo V6. What we do know is this. In the single-turbo configuration, the Buick ran 7.72 in competition eliminator. In the twin-turbo configuration at Bristol, it was running 7.3-second passes. Those times would have been pro stock caliber. In the Somerset in 1989 and 1990, it was qualifying for NHRA pro stock shows. The message was clear. This car belonged in pro stock racing. Buddy Ingersoll never wavered in his belief that what he was attempting was right. When sponsors freaked out, when racing drivers freaked out, when sanctioning bodies made political decisions instead of technical ones, when corporate interests protected their investments over the advancement of the sport, he kept pushing, he kept innovating, he kept showing up. In 2012, Buddy Ingersoll passed away. He was a man who had lived a lifetime as a racing pioneer. He had won championships. He had set records on the salt flats. He had proven that turbocharging worked in drag racing when others still doubted. He had created one of the most talked-about race cars in the history of the sport. And for all of that, one single turbocharged six-cylinder Buick stands as his most enduring legacy. A car that was never supposed to work. A car that nobody wanted to believe could compete. A car that scared the establishment so badly that they changed the political rules rather than deal with the technical reality. 6 cylinders against the world. And for one shining moment in the mid-1980s, the 6 cylinders were winning.